spoilers for DTF St. Louis. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's really good. So, for the most part, Americans like one flavor in their storytelling. If it's a comedy, it's got to be funny the whole way through, maybe a little bit of romance, possibly, but then back to comedy. It's a comedy. Drama's got to be serious, right? Comic relief character, maybe, sure, but then back to serious because it's a drama. But something very cool is happening. With this new crop of storytellers and the more readily available access to a ton of world storytelling traditions, people are understanding that many global stories tend to play fast and loose between emotional states and has done this for quite some time. Because, well, it's exciting. It's exciting not to know where a show is going to go, not only in plot, but also in emotional resonance. And I love seeing more mainstream audiences starting to embrace this versatile narrative structure. So this form of storytelling tends to lure you in with an exciting, fun, or generally approved premise, before revealing a more profound message or statement underneath. It's a trick. It's an old trick in terms of the global historical storytelling landscape, but it's a good trick. It tricks you into thinking you're watching one kind of story before slowly revealing that you've actually been watching another the entire time. And HBO's DTF St. Louis might be one of the funniest and most brutal examples of that I've seen in years. I remember seeing the trailers to this show and thinking, wow, this looks like trash. But turns out, DTF St. Louis owns. And I was incorrect. I also remember watching the trailer for the film Better Man and thinking, wow, this movie about a monkey looks like trash. And I was wrong about that one too, because Better Man also owns. I think I was mostly turned off by the name, DTF. It sounds like it was named by an ad executive who asked his 40-year-old daughter what young hip kids use as lingo. And now that I've finished it, I think the name is honestly one of the most clever acts of misdirection in the entire show. So the basic setup sounds like the ridiculous pitch meeting at Netflix. Yeah, come get me, Netflix. You haven't done anything good since BoJack Horseman. And I don't care who knows it. The premise is there is a dating app for married people called DTF St. Louis. There is a murder, a mystery, affairs, and lies, and detectives slowly trying to untangle what happened. Right, you know this story, a typical potboiler affair. And from the jump, the show introduces us to this cast of characters who all initially feel almost archetypical in a grayscale Coen Brothers sort of way. You got Floyd. Floyd initially feels like this caring, eccentric guy who believes in the inherent good in the world. He has this energy of a man who spent his entire life believing eventually things work themselves out. I mean, he's adorable. There's something immediately likable about him, and because of his overwhelming insecurities and sincerity, we want to see him succeed. And then you got his wife, Carol. That generic, self-obsessed, money-hungry spouse browbeating their partner to achieve more and do better. Lured by power, ambition, excitement, etc. You have Richard, her son, who is this awkward comic relief, the weird kid, the outsider. The audience sort of unconsciously accepts him as the odd one. Everyone knew a Richard growing up. And then there's Clark. Clark is kind of our lead at the start because he feels like this physical embodiment of suburban existential panic. A man who desperately wants life to feel larger, sexier, more dangerous, and more meaningful than it actually does. The kind of guy who discovers a hidden world and immediately decides this is the thing that's been missing from his life all along. Also, every way I just described these characters is entirely turned on its head by the end of the season. The format is also really interesting and can kind of catch you off guard. It's a truly bizarre storytelling rhythm that I genuinely cannot stop thinking about. In the show, an event happens, and we will fully watch this event happen. And then immediately after, we'll watch characters describe the exact same event we just saw. And normally, that sounds like terrible storytelling. It sounds repetitive. It sounds like a Netflix problem. Got him! But somehow DTF St. Louis turns this into the entire language of the show. Because sometimes in the show, what people say happened and what actually happened are often two completely different things. And conversely, and to the credit of this show alone, sometimes what people say happened and what actually happened are exactly the same thing. It becomes this layered, inverted Rashomon by way of suburban Missouri thing where every scene is simultaneously evidence, confession, fantasy, and self-defense. The show constantly rewrites and resubmits your understanding of moments retroactively, revealing your own bias towards characters and revealing deceit as well as integrity and sincerity in characters. The show keeps forcing you to compare reality against personal mythology. Also, I just found this show really funny. Like from episode 1, I was laughing out loud at this show. So comedy is super subjective and it really might not be your cup of tea, but I wanted to include that here. The thing that really starts happening a few episodes into DTF St. Louis is you suddenly realize the show is operating on multiple levels at the same time. At first, it feels like this darkly funny suburban crime story. Then it feels like a satire about middle-aged loneliness and sexual frustration. Then it starts turning into this incredibly sad examination of the stories people tell themselves in order to survive their own lives. And this transition is so smooth, it's hard to notice even on multiple watches. And what's wild is the show never abandons the comedy while doing this. That's the magic trick. It somehow maintains its comedy while simultaneously dropping you into this devastation. It's also weirdly this show about love, like love in all of its forms. The most beautiful of which is between Floyd and Clark. They care about each other and the other one's well-being. They constantly talk and bond and do activities together. So you were kind of waiting for this relationship to turn sexual, but it never really does. It's intimate. Intimacy is such a huge theme of this show. So often people mistake intimacy for sexuality because most people's understanding of affection is fairly binary. I'm not saying that's good or bad. Dude, I don't care. Do whatever you want to do. Go watch Netflix. It's garbage, but enjoy it. I love the show knows this, but the characters don't. So they as well are confused by this deeper affection towards each other and are also teasing the limits of it to see if it is sexual and not just intimacy. Can I also point out how much I love that there is this new niche inside of comedic shows right now of the joke being the characters just care and love each other? Like, go watch Haha You Clowns. The entire time you're going to be waiting for something more sinister to be revealed, but it doesn't. It's just the story of these three brothers who care about each other and love their dad. And guess what? Haha You Clowns also owns. The characters in DTF are funny because human beings are funny. The characters in DTF are sad because human beings are sad. People are weird. People panic. People say insane things trying to avoid embarrassment. People create bizarre fantasy versions of themselves because the real versions feel too disappointing to sit with for too long. And the show keeps alternating between these deep truths through this structure. By the back half of DTF St. Louis, the show starts doing something I genuinely did not expect from it. It stops feeling like a mystery about a crime and starts feeling like a mystery about people. And those are two very different things. Because at first you think the central question of the show is going to be, what happened? But eventually you realize the question is, how did these people become this emotionally lost? That's the actual mystery. And the deeper the show gets, the more uncomfortable it becomes because it starts stripping away everybody's little survival performance piece by piece. That's really what the storytelling structure is doing the entire time. We see events happen. Then we see people explain the events. And whether the explanation confirms or betrays the observed event, we eventually realize the explanation itself is the real revelation. Because people are constantly exposing themselves accidentally through the way they narrate their lives. Some people describe themselves like victims when they were clearly the aggressors. Some describe themselves like masterminds when we literally watch them panic in real time. Some leave details out not because they're trying to lie to others, but because they literally cannot emotionally survive acknowledging the truth about themselves. And the show becomes obsessed with that gap, the distance between who people are and who they think they are. There's this specific emotional exhaustion hanging over the entire series that becomes way more noticeable the further in you get. Everybody feels tired in a specifically modern way. It's a spiritual kind of tired. The kind of tired where your entire life becomes routine maintenance. You go to work, you pay the bills, you wave at the neighbors, you eat dinner, you scroll phone, you sleep, you repeat. And DTF St. Louis understands how psychologically destabilizing that can become for certain people, especially people who quietly imagine their lives becoming something bigger. Clark is really the beating heart of this idea. Because what makes Clark so fascinating isn't the fact that he wants excitement. Everybody wants excitement. What makes him fascinating is how desperately he wants transformation. He doesn't just want sex, he wants reinvention. He wants proof there's still some hidden version of himself waiting underneath his ordinary life. A more exciting version, a more dangerous version, a more desirable version. And the tragedy is that Clark fundamentally misunderstands what's actually missing in his life. Because he thinks he wants novelty, but what he really wants is intimacy. He wants to be known. There's this absolutely brutal sadness underneath Bateman's performance, where you slowly realize Clark has spent huge portions of his life emotionally untranslated. Like nobody has ever fully understood him, and after enough years he stopped believing that was even possible. So instead he starts chasing experiences. Fantasy becomes easier than vulnerability. Excitement becomes easier than honesty. And DTF St. Louis is so smart about this because it understands how often people confuse stimulation for fulfillment. Floyd represents something deeply human and deeply terrifying. The realization that your personality might have quietly become your fate. Floyd spent years following passion and instinct and impulse, believing sincerity would somehow save him, like wanting things badly enough would eventually create stability. But life doesn't work that way. Desire is not structure. Passion is not planning. Because underneath all the charm is a man who made a decision years ago, whether he consciously understood it or not. He chose personal passion over stability, over structure, over responsibility, over long-term security for both himself and the people who depended on him. And the brutal part is that he isn't malicious. He just assumed there would always be more time to fix things, more time to mature, more time to become the version of himself he imagined. Then suddenly, life hardened around him, and eventually Floyd starts recognizing this too late. That's the killer part. Sometimes things are too late. And because the show refuses to villainize him, it becomes heartbreaking instead of judgmental. DTF St. Louis constantly understands that people often ruin their lives very sincerely. That's what makes it feel so emotionally real. Nobody wakes up deciding, today I will slowly destroy my future. People drift. People rationalize, people delay, people assume they'll figure it out eventually. And then suddenly they're 50 years old sitting in a kitchen realizing eventually never arrived. Carol's storyline becomes maybe the most emotionally powerful for me in the show, because she slowly transforms from antagonist suburban wife into the clearest portrait of resilience in the entire series. The show gradually reveals just how much survival instinct shaped her personality, why she values stability the way she does, why she calculates every emotional risk, why security matters to her at a cellular level. And once you understand what she's survived, her entire character changes. What initially looked like guardedness reveals itself as discipline. What looked like emotional distance reveals itself as self-protection. What looked like rigidity reveals itself as somebody who learned very early that chaos destroys people. Then there's Richard, and man, Richard becomes rough emotionally by the end. Because the show slowly reveals that all his weirdness and awkwardness and outside behavior wasn't just quirky characterization. It was damage. The kid is hurting. And what's devastating is how realistic the show is about adolescent emotional pain. Although it's not adolescence, though. And adolescence, he feels confused, angry, embarrassed by himself, withdrawn, desperate to connect while simultaneously terrified of being seen. The show understands that children absorb the emotional atmosphere around them when adults pretend they don't. Kids absorb everything. Every tension, every silence, every disappointment, every fear adults think they're hiding. Richard feels like somebody growing up inside emotional instability, while everybody around him keeps insisting things are normal, which honestly might be the defining idea of the entire series. People insisting things are normal. That's the suburban horror at the center of DTF St. Louis. Not murder, not affairs, not sex, not secrets, performance. Everybody performing normalcy while internally unraveling. And the genius of the show is how funny it remains even while exploring all this darkness. Because honestly, human beings are funny. People having nervous breakdowns while trying to remain polite is basically the foundation of civilization. That's what DTF St. Louis keeps doing over and over, recontextualizing people, recontextualizing events. Somebody who seemed ridiculous becomes tragic. Somebody who seemed cold becomes understandable. Somebody who seemed confident becomes terrified. Love isn't one thing. People aren't one thing. And this show isn't one thing. It's a mystery, it's a farce, it's a romance, it's a tragedy. And through all of it, the show never loses its sense of humor. Because life is funny. Right up until suddenly it isn't. And then it gets funny again. And when we see over the fence at the lives across the street, there's only one certainty. Everyone looks normal.